Hey guys, I'm recording another video to help you guys kind of get started on iLearn days 26 and 27. I hope you guys are still doing well, still staying healthy, still staying socially distanced. But what I've done for these 2 days is where normally you would use a STEMscopedia in class and I would have you do all the questions in one day. Since you guys are working from home and this is kind of an unconventional environment for you to be learning in, I've split this up between two different iLearn days. Excuse me. iLearn day 26 is going to be the first half of the questions at the end of the STEMscopedia, and iLearn day 27 is going to be the second half. And all of those are entered into Google Forms, so there's no confusion as to what you guys need to answer. But before you guys dive into that, I thought I would take this opportunity to just quickly explain kind of the theme behind the STEMscopedia and what you've been doing in the past couple of iLearns. It's all this idea of how much energy we get out of aerobic respiration versus anaerobic respiration. So scrolling down through your STEMscopedia, you see this tab, it's anaerobic versus aerobic, and I really want you guys to focus on that and just mainly focus on the difference in the amount of energy you get between those two kinds of respiration. So when we talk about aerobic respiration, that word aerobic means with oxygen. So that's your normal cellular respiration. That's where there's plenty of oxygen and the process goes from glycolysis where you get 2 ATP, Krebs cycle, you get 2 ATP, and then finally the electron transport chain where you get about 32, which is where we get most of our energy. Well, anaerobic respiration is when respiration still takes place, but there's either no or not enough oxygen present in order to do the full aerobic cellular respiration. So what happens is when there's no oxygen present, glucose still goes through glycolysis, still gets split into the 2 pyruvate molecules, but those guys cannot enter into the mitochondria. So the Krebs cycle doesn't happen and the electron transport chain doesn't happen. Instead, there are 2 alternative processes depending on what species you are. So in most animals and in some bacteria, we go through what's called lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is where glucose is split into pyruvate, and then those 2 pyruvate molecules are then converted into a molecule called lactic acid. Lactic acid is not great to produce. This is not as beneficial as normal aerobic respiration. You guys have probably all experienced this. If you've ever gone to the gym or gone for a run and you've worked out to the point where your cells are having to use more oxygen maybe than you're able to provide them at the time, maybe you're out of shape, you're sore the next day. And the reason you are sore is because your cells are having to go through lactic acid fermentation. They're having to do that anaerobic respiration. So that lactic acid builds up in the muscles and it causes you to have that sore, stiff feeling. When someone dies, there's this phenomenon called rigor mortis. And what that means is their cells, as the person's heart has stopped beating, oxygen can't get to the cells anymore, all the cells start doing lactic acid fermentation because there's no oxygen. And that causes the body to stiffen up, become very rigid from all that lactic acid buildup in the muscles. So that's lactic acid fermentation. Now we still get 2 ATP from that because glycolysis still happens. We're just not getting the ATP that we would get from the mitochondria, which is where we get most of it. So lactic acid fermentation can't be used to sustain you for a long period of time, as you probably found out when you tried to do those wall squats while holding your breath. Now, most plants and fungi and some bacteria do a different kind of anaerobic respiration. This is called alcoholic fermentation. This is where glucose still gets split into pyruvate through glycolysis. We still get that 2 ATP. But instead of being converted into lactic acid, it gets converted into ethanol or alcohol. This is actually the alcohol that people drink in alcoholic beverages. This is the process that actually they do in breweries to make alcoholic beverages. There's a lot of money to be made if you want to be a biochemist and you want to get into alcoholic fermentation. But in this process, we have a different product made. You got alcohol, you still get that 2 ATP, but you also have carbon dioxide. So that's the whole idea behind anaerobic respiration. Depending on what species you're in, you either go through lactic acid or alcoholic, and you do not get enough energy to sustain you like you would with aerobic respiration. All right, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to email me.